Hello, this is Washington Squares. I am Michael Brennan Dougherty of Business Insider, and I'm here with Jamelle. Jamelle, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Jamelle Bouie. I am a writing fellow at the American Prospect magazine and also a Nobler fellow at the Nation Institute.
Fantastic. And so I wanted to talk this week about the Trayvon Martin case and the kind of backlash that we've seen in the media, that I've been grouped in, weirdly, by Gawker, and then just talk about like the larger dimensions of race in this. And so I wanted to put it to you, Jamelle, because I've been reading you on this topic, and you said that the Trayvon Martin case here has revealed that America is still a country sort of defined by its stratification by race. And I want you to just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think in that piece I mentioned that sort of it's a little interesting that's happening during an election year when we're sort of evaluating Barack Obama his past 4 years. And all of this just sort of took me back to 2008 when there was a very real sense that somehow the mere act of electing Barack Obama will help us get past some of our racial problems. What I think the Trayvon Martin case has done has both kind of put into stark relief how that isn't the case, and also revealed, I think when a lot of people hear racism, what they think of is Bull Connor or the KKK, or sort of those evocative images of Jim Crow. But in the 21st century, on a day-to-day basis, what happened to Trayvon is what racism is, and I'm not sure that people really recognize that and really understood it. And that's sort of what I mean. It's the fact that for a lot of African American men, they can't walk down a street without being questioned about their presence. It's the fact that a lot of parents of African American men, white or black, have to tell their kids, like, listen, when you turn 12 or 13, you're going to have to be much more cautious about what you do in public, because people will want to know, or people might want to know if you're supposed to be there. And so that right. To me, that more than the traditional images of racism, more than a lot of things, is what it means when people say that racism is still a problem in the United States. And everything about the Trayvon Martin case, I think, has illustrated that. Whether or not people will actually notice that fact is sort of up in the air. I myself am not optimistic, but I rarely am.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's... I agree with you that the sort of... I think you are right to say in that piece that America is still defined by this stratification by race. And I think a lot of conservatives want to push back on that, and sometimes I have too, since this case has come out, in the sense of, Max Reed in his piece in Gawker talked about how it seemed like for a week or so everyone was united about deploring what was going on in Sanford and wanting justice in this case. And then that seems to have split apart. I mean, I started noticing on comment sections about stories we were aggregating and doing here at Business Insider about the case that there was a significant part of readership, and this was across all sites I saw these stories, pushing back against the story that was being put out there. And I wonder if it didn't happen because for most of us outside of Sanford, and outside of Florida maybe, this isn't just a story about what would be the just thing to do in this one discrete case. It brings in these much larger themes of race, of class, the law and order, our justice system. And so, very naturally, I think, a lot of liberals look at this case and say, hey, these are the problems we've been trying to bring attention to for a long time and we haven't been talking about for a long time. And there are, larger issues of justice between the races, of inequality before the law. And I think a lot of people on the conservative side said, whoa, this is just about this one discrete case. Like, it doesn't have to be larger. I mean, one of the comments I always saw was like, why are we making this about race? Why are we making this about this? Why can't it just be whether the police did what they were supposed to do, whether Zimmerman should just be arrested? So what is the tension, I think? I mean, how do you see this tension between doing justice in a discrete case, for instance, say, investigating exactly what happened that night and exactly whether Zimmerman should be arrested, what he should be charged with exactly, and then how he should be punished if found guilty, versus saying that this is just symptomatic of larger things that we need to address.
I mean, for one, I don't see why you can't do both. I mean, I don't think there's...
Right.
I just don't think there's necessarily a division there. I mean, I think everyone on the I hate saying that there's a liberal side of this, because in my view there really
I don't think in the discrete, if we talk about it as a discrete case, there is, but I do think once there were people out there saying like, this is because of a gun law that conservatives signed, or this is because of a culture conservatives have contributed to, I think that's when a lot of people on the right got their back up and suddenly wanted to question the story itself.
Right.
So I don't like dividing that either, because I do think, I just don't think justice is liberal or conservative. but anyway, unfortunately, it's in some ways it's become that a little bit.
I think some of that, the partisanship that's gone into it, is unfortunately a product of the fact that President Obama commented on it. Sort of the mere...
Do you wish he had?
I'm tied, because on one hand I thought his statement, if I had a son he'd look like Trayvon, it was a really powerful thing. I think I said this on Twitter after he said it, but that this is why having an African American president is important to, I think, a lot of African Americans, that you have the top elected official in the country who can empathize in a very real way with what Trayvon's parents were feeling, in a way that's sort of that I'm not going to say wouldn't be possible, but it wouldn't feel the same way, I think, to a lot of African Americans if it came from the former President Bush, from President Clinton, or whoever. So I'm glad. I mean, in that sense, I'm glad he said it. I think it's a powerful thing to say. On the other hand, it just it fueled, or maybe even was the catalyst for this push to portray Martin as some kind of dangerous thug, or someone who was somehow deserving of what happened to him. That when Obama entered it essentially turned it into a partisan controversy. Whether or not that wasn't his intention, but that's sort of...
I don't think so. Yeah, I think you're right, it wasn't his intention. I thought it was inevitable that something, as soon as larger issues about our gun laws or the justice system were being invoked, I thought, this is going to become... just by the nature of the way the media itself is organized, around binary distinctions, around camps of people that have, two different constituencies, and some people have tried to negotiate it, right? Like, if you notice I think it was the New York Post, when it did its kind of really gross cover of 3 New York State senators wearing hoodies. And their line was like, I think their headline said something about like, that these people are exploiting the Trayvon tragedy. right? So they weren't saying yet that Trayvon somehow deserved this, or that we should suspect that he did. But they're trying to, like, I don't know, cut the baby in half.
Yeah.
Between the backlash and then this initial sense that everyone had that this was just, purely a crime that had to be investigated more. So, anyway, I think that's why we've started developing these two sides to it,
right.
When there may not be two sides at all.
Right. I don't think there's two sides at all either. And one thing that frustrates me a little bit is just I feel like there's been sort of in the popular conversation it's been lost sight of what I guess Trayvon Martin's advocates are looking for. It's not necessarily that they want Zimmerman thrown in jail, as much as it is that all of this is based in gross police misconduct when it comes down to it. That the police in Sanford just didn't do their jobs correctly.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't seem like, if I just want to elaborate on that, it didn't seem like they really investigated the crime scene all that well. They didn't take the chance to take all the physical evidence available, including, Zimmerman's clothes and other things. They did not seem extremely zealous about finding Trayvon Martin's next of kin and notifying him.
Which that's just really disturbing to me, honestly. It just really bothers me.
Yeah. Well, right, because it seems to really reduce Trayvon Martin down to it depersonalizes him, it dehumanizes him.
Right.
It's like, oh, this was some black criminal, and some black criminal died. Obviously, no one cares about him.
Right.
No, it seems really that to me, that one detail of not trying to find next of kin was the thing that most bothered me about it. At the same time, I did find myself occasionally in the past 2 weeks watching the coverage of this, worried about what will happen to Zimmerman. Is he being convicted in the public mind? Are people, that I guess famously this week, people were tweeting out his address, what they thought was his address,
right.
Including Spike Lee, and it turned out to be an elderly couple, and they received all this threatening mail and knocks on their door, etc., which is really unsettling. And I'd like you to explore this a little bit I guess this is always the debate between patiently working through the system as it is for justice as best as you can get it versus taking a radical stand, condemning the whole system, and then asserting, not that vigilantism would be asserting justice in this case, but I think there is a temptation or an impulse, and it's one that should be respected, that says this system utterly failed us. We have to go outside of the system. We have to really impose some kind of extreme social stigma on this kind of behavior, or otherwise we're going to continue getting it.
Right.
How do you peel through that?
I'm inclined to say that my immediate inclination is to say, no, we don't want to go outside the system. We don't. There's already a stigma against, for the most part, there's already a stigma against shooting people with no, on the street, for just walking down the street. The things, in one of the go back 3 weeks, one of the heartening things about all of this that it initially seemed that there wouldn't be a division between advocates of Martin and advocates of Zimmerman. It seemed clear to everyone who looked at the case that, at the very least, Zimmerman should be taken into custody, because shooting someone and killing them ought to be something that we look at that requires legal intervention regardless of how the verdict eventually goes.
Right, there has to be something that says this is a justified or unjustified homicide. Right.
So where I am,
anyways.
Basically, is I'm still at that point. I still want, what Zimmerman did. From the evidence we have, it seems like Zimmerman ought to have. He was told to stay in his car. It seems that he is the one who initiated this entire encounter. What I would like to see is just for him to have to explain his actions in a court of law. That's all I want. I don't think it's necessary to go outside the system. I don't think it's necessary to indict the system, because what is the system? Is it the Sanford Police Department? Maybe is it the state of Florida? Maybe, although people in the state of Florida are want to investigate this as well, is it the criminal justice system as a whole? Perhaps, I don't know. This system always strikes me as a very nebulous target. And so rather than attacking the system, let's aim for something concrete. Zimmerman should have to answer for himself in a court of law. We should pressure officials to move to that point. But beyond that, I'm not sure what else we do beyond that. That doesn't just sound like incoherent raging.
Right. Do you think there is, and I agree that's what I want too. Do you think, though, that will... It seems like most people want some kind of perfect moral clarity.
Yeah.
Julian Sanchez wrote a post saying that, whatever the details are of this case when we find them out, that doesn't have to alter or change your view of the world if you have convictions about American society. But yet people are almost trying to debate the different aspects or characterizations of Zimmerman and Martin in a way as if their worldviews really were in danger, which strikes me as startlingly insecure. But would the slow gears of justice satisfy people? I mean, it might satisfy you and me, but I think a lot of people feel like they want the cleanest possible exoneration or the clearest possible conviction and punishment.
Right.
And we do know that sometimes the justice system, even though it has virtues by being slow and methodical, also has the problem of people get their sentence or their conviction essentially downgraded because of certain technicalities. And in this case, because the police perform so poorly, that seems even more likely in a case like this.
Right.
And I do think a lot of people that are marching, that are out there wearing hoodies, they don't, I think this case is symbolic for them. It symbolizes all the times, like as you've said, that they've been told to, by their parents to pull their hood down or to walk a certain way after a certain time of night or in a certain neighborhood. There's this desire to inflict a kind of vicarious justice.
Yeah.
And I feel like that desire will not find its fulfillment in this case if it goes to court.
I think you're right. The initial investigation was so shoddy that if Zimmerman does go to court, and even if there's not necessarily evidence to convict him of much, and so because I do also think that a lot of people on either side are looking for some sort of definitive verdict. I'm sure that some people protesting on behalf of Martin and his family just sort of assumed that if this were to go to court, Zimmerman were clearly going to be convicted. That's not actually the case. We don't really know what would happen, but my hunch is that it would result in a lesser charge and like a small amount of jail time.
Right.
Then.
But I mean, that certainly doesn't satisfy. That would not satisfy either, I think, people's feelings about this case or the desire to channel the outrage people feel into activism and political action.
Right.
That they believe would prevent cases like this happening again.
Right. I mean, I think regardless of some of this will have to require some flexibility on part of the activists who've gotten involved, right? That they'll have to say, regardless of how this turns out for Zimmerman, the important thing from that isn't necessarily that Zimmerman gets convicted and goes to jail per se, but that the justice system, the legal system, has recognized that the killing of Trayvon Martin meant something, and that someone has to answer for it in some way. And then from there, I think the logical place to focus the anger that they feel is, toward the stand your ground law in Florida, which, I'm not someone who's particularly squeamish about guns. I'm not. I essentially think that people should be able to own a gun if they, as long as they have been legally shown not to be unbalanced.
Right.
And passed a test or whatever. I'm pretty much, if there's a mainstream when it comes to like gun ownership laws, that's where I am. I grew up in a rural part of Virginia. My parents own guns. Like it's not really a thing for me. But I think that both people who support gun control, people who are a bit more skeptical about gun control, I think we can all agree that any law which incentivizes the kind of action committed by Zimmerman and many other people in Florida. Like there's been a large uptick in the number of justifiable homicides since this law was passed on a bipartisan basis in 2005. So that to me seems like we're insofar anger should be focused anywhere, should be towards that law. An effort to get this law repealed, not as an attack on gun owners, but as a way of saying, this creates a dangerous environment for people in our state and does nothing really to, help people exercise their freedom to own guns. It kind of just seems like a recipe for danger.
Yeah. It's interesting. I read the Stand Your Ground law as it was passed, and a few things came to my mind. That one, I wasn't sure. I was not sure that it applied in this case, in the sense that it's written.
Yeah.
Because it says in the law quite clearly that if you initiate a confrontation, that the law does not protect you.
Right, but that's sort of a fuzzy point, right? Because does initiate a confrontation mean in the case of the Martin case? Does it mean
this kind of following that Zimmerman did or pursuing?
Or like if
and then
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and then we don't know. I mean, I think it's safe to say we really don't know what happened after. We know that Zimmerman pursued Martin in some way. He was following him in his car and then got out on foot to pursue him. And then everything in between that and the gunshot is pretty much subject for debate or for further evidence to tell us what happened. So it would be a question is, okay, did Zimmerman follow Martin in such a way that was very provocative and scary? And in a sense, does Martin have the claim to stand his ground? I think that would be a legitimate question.
Right.
So I read this law and I thought, well, this law to me seems to codify something sensible, which is just that there are such things as justifiable homicides that take place outside of a home. However, the way it's worded does seem, and you hit the word before, incentivizes. It does seem, I don't know if it incentivizes the actions of a person like Zimmerman. I don't know. But it certainly makes it seem, if you're a prosecutor or a cop in Florida, it definitely, to me, would seem like a burden or a disincentive to charging someone with murder if I felt they had any plausible sounding case that there was some kind of danger for them.
Right.
Right. And so that, I think, is I don't know if the text of the law in itself would be bad in a perfect society, but it does seem like the way it places the legal burden of proof creates bad incentives for a justice system that, is overworked, for police that are often overworked, and so I do think that it presents a problem that way. I mean, that's just my reading of it. And if it produces that kind of incentive, I think it needs to be rewritten or repealed.
Yeah. My take on the law has sort of been that this is like justifiable homicides, or the idea that there's the justifiable homicides can happen outside of the home, as you put it, is something that it seems to me should be left to discretion of law enforcement prosecutors. I don't understand why there needs to be a law for it. In other words, like if you killed someone in self-defense, there should be enough evidence, sort of like in this scenario, for you to be able to claim self-defense, and like that be a totally, that be something that you can stand on in a court of law. It just, the law itself seems like a solution to a problem that I'm not sure. I don't know the situation in Florida, but it seems like a solution to a problem that didn't really exist. That all these people were killing people in self-defense, and then were getting thrown into jail for it.
The way you put it just actually turned my mind a little bit more on it. And I think you're right. I think in a way, the stand your ground law, it may give a sort of legal privilege. It could almost be read as a legal privilege that's unjustly given to, say, lawful gun owners, right? Yeah. And I think you might be right on that. I think my mind is just not changed entirely, but slightly turned on that subject then. And then it would be a bad law entirely. Sorry, it's just.
I mean,
it's good to,
like when you were talking about when you said that when you were describing that idea popped into my head, just like that, the legal, this like justifiable homicide should be something the legal system should be able to handle without an additional law.
Right. I mean, it's sort of like putting your thumb on the scale before the case even happens.
Right.
In favor of someone who has a gun license and everyone else. Now, I'm for people having their guns and having them licensed and, being trained to use them safely or trained in gun safety. I'm for all that. I'm not trying to say that should be discouraged. What I am saying is that just because you've gone through that shouldn't mean that in any situation where you could claim that you were somehow in danger, that just gives you the right to shoot and ask questions later.
Right. And I mean, I keep on thinking, there are a lot of people who in a state like Florida that probably own guns, own concealed weapons, and if they know that they can stand your ground, then that the mere act of them taking out a gun just escalates the situation to a point where something that may have been able to be resolved peacefully or with minimal violence ends up becoming a tragedy. I feel like this is just conjecture on my part, but I feel like a lot of people think that you take out, if you're feeling threatened, you take out a gun to sort of warn someone off, but not at all. I mean, sort of number one rule of gun safety is if you pull out your gun, you better be ready to shoot it. Like, that's the only reason why you should be removing a gun from where you have it. And just in my mind, like, any law that makes it even slightly more likely that 5% of people are going to pull out the gun to warn someone off is a law that's just inevitably going to cause people to die who wouldn't have otherwise had to die.
Right. So I want to ask, what have you... I kind of want to just ask you, what have you been feeling during this kind of pushback and backlash where people around Zimmerman are pushing back on the story which had initially evoked so much outrage in the public? And then on the other side, other people are trying to dig up dirt on Martin, and it seems that they've found pictures of him trying to what I would call just fronting, which is something like my friends would do in high school and take pictures of themselves looking ridiculous or looking more tough. No, I'm serious. We ran a piece on that on our site. Was that even if all of these pictures were Martin, it still wouldn't be a reason to shoot him in the street.
Right.
But what have you been feeling during that? I'm just curious as an observer.
Yeah. My thought is just that, it's exactly what you said. I'm sure that when I was 17 years old, I, took lots of stupid pictures of me giving the finger to a camera or whatever. I'm sure that if I didn't have Facebook in high school or anything, but I'm sure that if you were to record my conversations with my friends, you would hear me saying ridiculous things. I'm sure if you were to record the track list in my car in high school, you'd be like, man, that kid has anger issues, all that NWA and Fugazi he's listening to. And it's sort of, you can do that for almost any 17-year-old, and so I don't quite understand what the point's supposed to be. Is it supposed to be that Martin was a typical 17-year-old, therefore he doesn't deserve your sympathy or pity? No, he's nothing he did as a kid, not even getting suspended for having, an empty marijuana baggie, which to me, sounds basically innocuous. I went to a pretty well-to-do high school in Virginia Beach, and a lot of kids smoke marijuana, none of them criminals. None of these things really mean anything. None of them justify him being killed or being followed or anything. And Ta-Nehisi Coates made a very good point today, and that is this smear campaign against Martin, or this attempt to portray him as somehow undeserving of your sympathy, sort of comes down to a very ugly idea, and that is a black teenager simply must be suspicious in some way. That's sort of my thought, and I had my kind of slightly unrelated thought, is that this is all coinciding with a bunch of separate controversies about the Hunger Games and sort of the black characters in the movie and people's negative reactions to that, which, at least on the internet, it seems like there's been this upsurgence of racism in a really troubling in a really troubling way that even surprises me, and I'm usually pretty cynical about these sorts of things.
I want to speak to two things about that, which is, one, I feel as if racist attitudes are more acceptable in polite company now than they were when I was young. I don't know if I was innocent in the 90s, but I remember in my childhood racial consciousness and consciousness about the injustice of racism just being drummed into me in school and in popular movies. When I was 12 or 13 at a youth group meeting at a Lutheran church, we would watch a movie like Higher Learning, which deals with issues of racism in college, or so I felt like that was in the air. And I guess as I've grown up, I've just noticed, maybe it's the internet that has unleashed this in some ways, or allowed people to be racist with each other in a kind of anonymous way and then reinforce that worldview.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know.
I actually, I mean, I want to speak just to this. I was accused earlier this week, by Gawker of feeding into and being a part of this backlash. And I have to confess it was my own fault. Because I tried to write a post on the backlash as I was seeing it last weekend, just building up, that there was this like counter-narrative developing, where people were saying, oh, somehow Martin was casing houses in Sanford, and he was stopped, and then, just kind of all these fantastical things. And so I started to write a piece about that and about the effect of how, as liberal commentators kind of added an ideological edge to this story, there was going to be a pushback from conservative commentators. So I tried to write something, and I was using these phrases like, well, they don't believe the media, and they remember the Duke lacrosse story, where some white kids were kind of convicted in the public mind before the evidence came out, and then they remember this, and they remember that. And I remember showing it to, and then I pulled up images I saw on Stormfront, a neo-Nazi message board. I had seen those images because I was deleting racist comments from our own website on these stories. So, someone would say, well, look at this, and then a kind of bit.ly link would be there. I'd click through, oh, it's Stormfront. I was like, oh, so the racists are really putting stuff out there. Let's look at it. So I drew up this post, and then my editors were like, well, this seems kind of wimpy, saying, like, what these people think or they think, and it's kind of all amorphous, and they're like, well, what do you think? So then I started saying, well, the point is we still need to learn a lot more about the evidence. And then it turned out one of the images embedded in this Stormfront image wasn't of Trayvon Martin. The other image was. Right. So we took it down and issued corrections. And then it just looked like, oh, Dougherty is stoking up racism by quoting this stuff, and then he's saying he kind of agrees with it, which I didn't mean to imply. I just meant to imply that we have to wait for more facts, and that's the only legitimate point in the story. In any case. But it just seemed very predictable, and I do think... I don't know how to quantify racism, though. I don't know how to measure it, to get back to this larger point of, does this seem more acceptable today? To me, there are so many things, as a guy, I'm going to be 30 years old soon, I have a mortgage, I live in Westchester County, New York. There are so many things I deal with in life, like where to buy a home, how people talk about public schools, that so often have coded words that convey racist concepts.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Right? So people talk about a good neighborhood, and I know literally they mean a mostly white neighborhood. It seems more and more like that's almost becoming explicit, or, I don't want to say that whenever someone says a good neighborhood or a good school, that they mean it's white, and that they mean it consciously, because I don't think it's always conscious. But, that, I don't know, that's the reality I'm seeing and experiencing.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. Do you have any ideas about how to quantify this, or a sense that this is being raised, or is it just we've grown up and now we're seeing?
I honestly, I feel like there are a lot of things going on, and it seems like there are two things that are happening at cross purposes. On the one hand, when polled, people usually express pretty tolerant racial attitudes. They support interracial relationships. They have no problem with their kids going to schools with children of other races. They denounce sort of like openly racist rhetoric. If a politician were to say something openly racist towards anyone, they would pretty quickly find themselves in hot water. On the other hand, I think you're right. I think, the internet has made sort of anonymous racism. It's easy. You can go on a message board, you can go on YouTube or whatever, and just like kind of spew out racist comments. It's not even necessarily anonymous. I mentioned the Hunger Games thing. People are tweeting racist remarks about the black characters in their movies, and their identities are attached. I mean, these are like teenagers and people in their early 20s. Like, their identities are attached to their Twitter feeds. There's the website youropenbook.org, which sort of takes advantage of the fact that Facebook has very little privacy controls. You can sort of do bulk searches of Facebook profiles for particular words and phrases, and it's not hard at all to find lots of racist remarks and sentiments attached to people's public Facebook profiles.
Right, people say, and it's funny, there's a site that did it. I mean, you just have to search for it, but if you search for the phrase, not to be racist, but, and you can see, like, and actually, they're kind of, I mean, some of these are funny. I mean, you laugh because you've seen this, right? You've seen people's Facebook, and they say, like, and they say the most ridiculous thing.
I mean, it's almost a joke that not to be racist, but it's just like the preface for something that's about to be really racist.
That's racist. It's funny, I always thought that this verbal construction always indicates that you're about to be exactly what you said you were. Like, a guy might say, maybe a slightly feminine guy might say, not to be a dick, but, or a woman might say, not to be a bitch, but,
right.
As if it, like, gives them permission to then immediately be a dick, or be a bitch, or be racist. But yeah, it's weird. I mean, what do you think do you think this is just a function of the fact that people share so openly, or do you think that there's been a real uptick? I think it could be a matter of both, where people have always been this kind of weird and ignorant about each other, and then at the same time, we may be seeing more racism, and I think we might be seeing that partly because there's so much segregation by class and by zip code now.
Right.
I mean, one thing, Charles Murray's book about the separation of whites into these increasingly disconnected classes really does demonstrate well, is that we are, in a lot of ways, a far less integrated society. I mean, in a major city like New York, where I'm sitting right now, I'm going to have interactions with people of all races every single day.
Right.
But they might be just very brief, usually commercial interactions, or just maybe professional. But then in Westchester County, where I live, I happen to live in, I think, one of the most diverse towns, Mount Kisco. But we've had, the whole county has been accused of doing things with its real estate to prevent minorities from moving in. And, since the 60s, it seems like de facto segregation socially is becoming almost more intense, even as America is becoming, on the grand scale, more diverse.
Right. I wanted to go back to something briefly. Part of what I think, I agree with you that there's probably always been this level of sort of just like general ignorance, but I think what we're also seeing, especially among younger people who express these sentiments, is that the racial conversation in this country is usually pretty unhinged from any history. That, like, you're taught that racism is bad, that racism is judging people on the basis of the race, that a long time ago black people were segregated, and that there was the Ku Klux Klan, and all these things are very bad, but then they ended. But there's no real discussion of what any of that means for the present day. And so I think a lot of kids have the impression that they've garnered from school and from popular culture that, and then you the other thing is that you have, like, I feel like more now than ever, African Americans are sort of like the driving force in pop culture as far as music is concerned. To a lesser extent, movies, but most kids listen to hip hop. Most pop songs have like some hip hop component or whatever. It's just like a very common thing, and so you at once have this sort of very diverse pop culture, a historical narrative that sort of doesn't really underscore the extent to which racial inequalities exist today. And so you have a bunch of kids who things that are racist are kind of decoupled from from what makes them racist. And so it's like one comment you see a lot, I feel like I see a lot on the internet is, I don't mean this in a racist way, but like X, Y, and Z. I want to do blackface, but I don't want to mean it in a racist way. Which is sort of a ridiculous statement because blackface is like by definition. There's no way to do like you can satirize blackface, but you simply can't like dress up in blackface and have it not be racist because you personally have no animus towards black people. And I think that's a concept that just like is lost upon a lot of people.
See, I think that's right. I also think, I think that's part of human nature, or at least maybe part of our society's. I don't know if this is, can be said of every society, but I do think there's a certain chauvinism of the present that always exists, right? So we always say, like, I think there is a common attitude. There's kind of like this holdover Whiggish attitude that the past is oppression, and then there's this march towards greater and greater freedom. And here we are, and because it's very difficult for people to believe that they are blind through their own fault or ignorant of injustice that they participate in. They assume that, right now we're living in, a time of almost like are on the doorstep of achieving a just society.
Right.
And that, like, all that's left, I find an attitude among young people my age is that, the only injustice left is marriage equality for gays and lesbians. And to my own ears, not only do I dissent from some things people call justice, but this seems like an incredibly naive sense about the human condition or about history and society.
No, I agree. This has long been sort of one of my complaints, intellectual complaints, I guess, about the modern era, which there doesn't seem to be really an awareness of the extent to which our slice of human history is very, very much quite small, and B, there's nothing that guarantee progress. But like, there's no reason why 100 years from now we're not living in a new dark age. Like, there's nothing that's not. It's not guaranteed that we will be better off in the future than we are now.
And in fact, it's very likely that the future will look at this time and see it as horrifying. I am quite serious.
No, I laugh because I agree that like there are things that we do at this point in time that like large scale ecological destruction. Our descendants will look back and say, "What the hell were they thinking? Did they not realize what they were doing?" Like when in 50 years or 100 years, like large swaths of Bangladesh are just like underwater. Those humans will say, "What? Did they not see this happening?"
It's funny because we have different ones because we're, you're on the liberal end and I'm on the conservative end. Whereas, like, I feel like in 20 years or so, or 30 years, surgical abortion will be looked at with horror. I think chemical abortion will be looked at as, like, the responsible thing.
Yeah.
But I think people in the future will be like, wait, they actually put sharp tools into women to accomplish abortion, and they'll look at it with a horror that is like a more intense version of the horror we have of medieval dentistry or something.
Or like radical mastectomies, which used to be, they basically carved out the breasts and sort of like every piece of tissue that could possibly connect to it.
And I feel like this is, and these can happen on society-wide things. We could also live, there could be a future in America where humanity adopts an ethic of, racial separatism, and they look back at this time period, and they say that it was horrifying, like diversity was horrifying.
Right.
Progress is not. Human civilization is literally what we make of it. We can change it. I don't think you or I currently, like as one or two people, have the power to change a nation of 300 million people. But collectively, we do make changes to society. And someone would look at Germany in 1928, maybe, or 1930, and say, wow, there's real progress in society. We've really picked things up since World War I. We've, destroyed the ancient regime. We're onward to the uplands of civilization. In fact, people that are doing something horrible in society usually do believe they're accomplishing something great.
Right.
Anyway, we agree that there's like a naive view of human nature. Is that something that can be inculcated, though? Like a more mature view? Is that something we can educate people into in school, or is that something that they just have to come by through effort?
See, that's a question I've had for a long time, and I'm not sure. Because I feel like, part of what, part of America's elemental greatness, right, is that we have this naive view of history, and it both, it both acts as a blender, and, we stumble into really bad things because of it, but it also allows us to reinvent ourselves every generation in a way that's really quite admirable and really quite unique. So I'm not sure something you want. I don't know. It's both a good thing and a bad thing, and I'm not sure if you can make people be aware of its dangers through education. I think it just might be something you stumble upon. I don't know. That's a good question. It's a good and a hard question, and I don't know.
Right. For me, it was my religion that gave me that view. I was, as a teenager, like a Whig. I believed that, there were the Dark Ages, and then there was Jim Crow, or there was slavery and Jim Crow, and it all sucked, and then it got fixed. And then later on, as I read more history, and but then also had the theology of an awareness of the imperfectibility of man and society. I wanted to hit one more thing before we close this off, kind of taking it back to our conversations about race, which is, you wrote recently that we have all this talk lately of how America is rapidly becoming a majority-minority country demographically. And you wrote something provocative in the sense of, I'm not sure. Why don't you explain that a little bit? I don't want to spoil it.
Yeah. So I guess the TLDR version is that to say that we're becoming a majority-minority country is to sort of ignore the extent to which the likely minority in this scenario, which is Latinos, have a very diverse racial classification themselves, and aren't. It's not just, the Latino identity is in part somewhat invented as a result of political realities. But you have light-skinned Latinos, you have Anglo Latinos, you have the Latinos of African descent, you have people you have increasing rates of intermarriage. You have more children who are Latino white, Asian white, so on and so forth. And so, given how the category of whiteness has grown and expanded over the course of American history, to me, at least, it seems just as likely that we have in 50 years a white America where white simply just means white, in addition to being people of European descent, direct European descent, also just includes a large class of people with Hispanic and Asian last names. Right? There's nothing really to say that those people will still identify as Latino and Asian already, or continue to identify as Latino and Asian. And politically, even if that weren't the case, politically, there's nothing to guarantee in 50 years that Latinos and Asians and minorities in general will maintain this kind of political solidarity you see now. There's just
that's right.
For me, there are just too many unanswered questions for anyone to really be able to make the assessment that the United States is going to be a majority minority country. American history to me suggests that whiteness will continue to expand. Blackness will be sort of the divide, the non-black divide. And that we'll have a more diverse society, certainly, but the racial divides of 50 years from now, I think, will be very similar to the racial divides of now.
It's an interesting question too, because it's you can broaden it not just from American history, but to the history of the Americas.
Right.
And if you look at Brazil or Mexico, there are racial divides that still persist in those countries, where light-skinned people, kind of broadly construed, still hold most of the political power, even in intensely diverse nations. And further, there's also, history is also strange too, in the sense of we don't know if in 25 years or 30 years, you could imagine an alternate history where Quebec breaks off of Canada, and then large parts of Canada are assimilated into the United States, and suddenly... actually, there have been politicians, essentially, that have almost invoked that. I mean, Pat Buchanan has almost, looked to Nova Scotia and other places...
Yeah.
As potential future American states. And, so we can't predict that. And then on the other hand, too, we don't know, as the Hispanic, if you look at ethnic population, grows, you don't know how Hispanics and blacks will continue to see each other politically in the context of America.
Right.
Will they see each other as allies in a struggle for, the prerogatives and resources of society? Whether they're from the government or from just society itself, honor. Or whether they'll, you can imagine situations where, you don't even have to imagine, you can see in cities where there's real divide.
Right.
The black-brown divide.
Right.
Is there any future? I'm trying to end on a hopeful note. Can you envision a future when this will sound wrong, but this racial divide you speak of, that's defined in terms of blackness? Can you envision a future where that's not the case? Where you might live or your children might live, where America is not, that's not the primary racial divide.
I'm of two minds of this. You might be catching me on a bad week, where I'm absolutely not.
Okay, obviously. Obviously, that's why it's important to ask.
But what I'm feeling a bit more positive about all of this what I think to myself is that 40 years ago, 50 years ago, I couldn't date my girlfriend. My girlfriend is white. We, living in Virginia, we couldn't be together. In fact, there's a non-trivial chance that I would have been subject to violence just for dating her. And so that was only 50 years ago, a relatively short period of time. And when I look at it like that, I actually am pretty hopeful that, maybe the divisions will never go away. Maybe there'll always be problems. I think, the fact that slavery was a part of our founding, I think it's sort of, there's like that nugget will always be with us. It's sort of just like, I think Condoleezza Rice called it our birth defect. And I think it's a very apt way of putting it. We'll always have it. But that doesn't mean it has to be something that's debilitating. In that, I think,
right.
50 years from now, 100 years from now, I can very, very much imagine a future where the kind of divides we see now or that we saw in the past aren't nearly as bad. In fact, they might not be there at all.
I hope that's the case. I'm like you. I'm also skeptical. Just in the sense, I just feel that democratic societies tend to find ways of creating us's and them's in our politics, and in a diverse society, it feels like race is always available, and the remedies that have been tried to bridge that, I either find a little bit scary in themselves. So, like, one remedy might be an intense nationalism.
Yeah.
Right? Where we just say we're all Americans. And, I mean, you see this. I mean, it's like the typical World War II film was like, okay, in this company, you're an Italian, you're an Irishman, you're a Jew, and I'm the white bread American boy leading us, and we're all together fighting the same enemy. I would prefer not to live in a society that can create that kind of nationalistic feeling, because that usually means you're involved in some kind of desperate war effort.
Right.
And then at the same time, some people envision that Christianity could do this. I don't think that's possible in a country where 22% of people don't have any religious affiliation, and only 17% of people are regular churchgoers. It seems we're too diverse religiously, and even if Christianity could be that ethic, there's still what kind of Christianity and what kind of church.
Right.
So I just don't know what force would efface this distinction or make it seem unimportant in creating an us and a them. I mean, I hope for one.
Yeah, I mean,
that's I asked for a hopeful note, and then I created a more depressing one.
I guess my view, when you boil it down, is that I hope people can be people in the best way possible, and that, like, over time, we're just excellent to each other, to borrow a line.
That way, I mean, I guess that's what we can hope for. And maybe that is something that actually could be infused into public education in a way that's not horrifying.
Yeah.
It sounds a little Confucian. It sounds almost like Confucianism in a way. But if it's that simple, that's fine by me. I think we've probably exhausted the time here.
I think we have.
But I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this with me this week. And we'll hopefully do something like this again in a happier news cycle.
Yeah, no, definitely. This was a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you, Jamelle.
Thank you.
Take care.